You first. India has banned 59 Chinese apps, citing security and privacy concerns. Do you believe that was why?
Do I believe? I think this India has to do something to appease national resentment at home first, and second, maybe this is also a step towards showing a kind of signal to China that India is not, a country that cannot do anything vis-a-vis China in a conflict like that. But I think this kind of decision is more for the consumption home audience, and because there is rising resentment in India about this conflict or skirmish between China and India, and of course Modi's, I believe, motivation of doing this is to please the Indian people and to show that he's a tough leader. He can say no to China. He can take some real actions against China. But we have to notice that this is, in my view, is not really a bad news because its attention has been shifted from a possible military clash in the border area to economic, clash, which, in my view, is very much manageable, much easier to manage for both sides.
So to appease the domestic anger towards the Chinese, Mr.
Yes.
Deepak in New Delhi, do you agree? Would you like to add anything?
Yes, I don't agree to this proposition because I believe that India seriously believes that the border has been ingressed. The coordinates which China sought in its 1962 map, so they have been shifted further west, and it has changed the status quo. So therefore, I think what Prime Minister Modi is signaling to China that if the border remains hot, the relationship in economic domain, it cannot be as usual. So I think that is the message according to me.
So now, that was not precisely on national security or privacy concerns, right? Because TikTok and other Chinese apps, Chinese companies had been in India for a long time.
Yes, I think in one way, I think they could be correlated if we see the government office order, India revoking this, sovereignty and territorial integrity clause. I think it is in that context, but I think primarily it depends on the situation along the border. So if it continues to flare up, I think the ripples they would be felt in other sides also. And I think Prime Minister Modi, through this, or rather India, so it is wanting to give a signal that the border flare up, it will have repercussions in other areas. So this is just maybe the starting point as far as economic fallout of this is concerned, and various other ministries, so they are also weighing the options whether they should allow the contracts given to Chinese companies. For example, yesterday Nitin Gadkari, who is in charge of transportation, so he said that this would also be reevaluated. So implying that the worth of almost 63 billion US dollar contracts contracted by India with China, so they would be at a stake. So I think the economic fallout of this border crisis, so it is very much there.
Well, Joseph, what do you think? Professor Deepak just said that this is the beginning of the economic fallout from the recent military clash.
I think that both perspectives from the two other guests have merit. On the one hand, this does open an opportunity to shift the conflict away from the border and into economic spheres, but it can also be seen as an escalation. I think it gives an opening for, as we've seen already with some of these companies, Chinese companies, opening dialogue with the Chinese government to see what they need to do to appease New Delhi. And that takes some pressure off Beijing-New Delhi negotiations. But I think the real concern at this point is whether or not India is starting to fall into this American narrative of Sino-technophobia and digital Orientalism. And I think India is very vulnerable to this because for a long time, even in India, there have been concerns that India is effectively a data colony of other strong IT powers. So, I think that if India is going down that path, this represents more of an escalation than a shifting away.
That's original. Professor Deepak in New Delhi, let's talk about the latest development. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi flew to the northern Himalaya region of Ladakh on Friday to visit Indian troops. He was accompanied by the Chief of Defense, also the Chief of the Army. What message is he sending here, and to whom?
I think this is three-pronged. One is he is there to take stock of the deployment, take stock of the equipment and the morale of the Indian forces. But I think at the same time, it is a message to China, at least as far as border is concerned, that there would be, no pulling back of India unless and until the status quo ante is restored. So that is, the positions of India and China before May, or we say that April end, when patrolling from both the sides, so they were taking along these points of fraction, be it in Galwan or Pangungso or in the hot springs area. But it appears that China is reluctant to yield, or rather it has consolidated. That is at least the viewpoint in India, that China has consolidated its positions along these points of fraction. And this has also been acknowledged by the Chinese side, and some of the Chinese analysts say that the places where we have ventured in, so they are better. They are defensible, and then we can hold on them very, very tightly. So this is one aspect of it, and in the face of this, I believe Indian Prime Minister would like to tell China that if the border situation remains like this, or if the status quo is not changed, then India is there for a big in a long haul. And third aspect of this is also to the world that India is resisting China's belligerence on the border, and it will stand by but the position it has taken, that is the restoration of status quo ante. And if that is not respected or enforced by China along border, so then so we are there ready for maybe.
Well, I want to give our friend in Beijing, Professor Huang, a chance to respond to what you just said. Professor Huang, what do you think? What does Beijing want to do with India right now?
I think Beijing obviously want to have a good and stable relationship with India, because the two neighbors have to be in a good relationship, no matter where you want to say. But I do want to differ from Professor Deepak's point that the status quo has been changed by China's side. Prime Minister Modi said very clearly in his address to the nation, I think Professor Deepak must also see that, that no Indian territory has been invaded. And that's what Modi said. Modi said the Indians has not been invaded, which means China or any others has not invade India on this issue. So if that's the case, how could the status quo be changed by China's side? And I think that clearly shows that Modi's position on this. That is, of course, Modi has to appease the very strong national resentment at home. And Modi also have to keep, like you said, I agree with you, keep the Indian Army's morale high out of this clash. But that does not mean that India thinks China has changed its status quo. And I don't know who do you refer to when you say that China experts said that China is going to reinforce its a stronghold in the border area. And those stronghold has been there for many years. It's not newly established. It is Indian side that has been established over 40 or 50 stronghold along the area. And as far as I know, it's the Indian side that has across the actual control line after the army level talk between India and China. This commander acted on its own. This is internationally known. But of course, Indian side has their own story. But Indian story doesn't mean it's truth. Because I really appreciate Prime Minister Modi's points that India has not been invaded. It is not in China's interest either to invade India on this. But one thing I have to point it out here is that the border area or the border conflict between China and India is not of a simple bilateral problem. It's a problem of internal dignity and the integrity of both nations. Because those border, let me finish, this border along China-India was not drawn by Indians, neither by Indians nor by the Chinese. It was drawn by the British. So therefore, both sides, both Beijing and New Delhi, understand that they have to be very, very careful to handle the border issues. Otherwise, there will backlash at home to give rise to a very strong national resentment. So therefore, for a long time, I think it's an understanding for both China and the Indian, for both leaders, that this border issue is more a matter of management, not for solution, because it's not realistic to try to solve those issues. So therefore, I think both leaders have to be very careful not to let this border conflict escalate into a full-fledged clash. That's nobody's interest in doing that.
Professor Deepak, do you want to respond?
Yes, I think as regards the first point, the criticism of Prime Minister Modi in Indian media and television channels, whether print or electronic, it has been very, very severe. So people are perplexed in what state of mind Prime Minister Modi uttered these words. But at the same time, Prime Minister Modi also uttered some other words, saying that those who will cast an evil eye on Indian territory, they will be given befitting reply. So that is my first assertion. And the second is that if China has not changed the status quo in Galwan and Finger 4 to 8 areas, then, for example, the satellite images which are available with us, they are in open domains, and also the coordinates which were provided by China to India during the 1960 border negotiation, they clearly tell a different story. It implies that at least a few hundred meters in Galwan, so the line of actual control, which is perceived by maybe both sides, so it has been altered. So I believe that, it is because of this friction, so that primarily these points of friction along borders, as long as we don't first disengage from there and then gradually de-escalate, the border situation will remain tense.
Mm-hmm. Well, Joseph, from the American point of view, how does the current escalation of China-India relations play into America's Indo-Pacific strategy?
I think there are a number of issues here. To kind of build on what some of the previous discussion, I think the status quo was always not very durable. But the real change, I think, came when the Trump administration basically decided to disengage from Pakistan, and in that context, with China's strong engagement, this is what really, I think, set the wheels tumbling ultimately. But we have to remember that the United States has used Pakistan twice to enter Central Asia, firstly in the late 70s to contest the Soviet Union and Afghanistan, and then secondly after 9/11, where they built air bases in the countries on China's western border, which created strategic concerns for China. And so, we look today at Belt Road Initiative and these other development strategies. In part, they're aiming to try to create more co-economic mutual growth and development in order to prevent that type of insecurity. And this has frustrated Washington, and as a result, they abandoned Pakistan, and that in turn has undermined Indian security. And at the same time, the United States has turned to India and tried to offer its not only its anti-China narratives, but entice India into an alliance against China. Now, I think this is really a danger for New Delhi, and I think they perceive the danger. On the one hand, they have a very firm tradition of an independent foreign policy, and they know that if they enter this type of arrangement, that it's going to increase their security concerns and in turn make them more dependent on the United States. So I think New Delhi's in a very difficult position at this moment, and I don't see how they get out of it except for the possibility if China is able to make some sort of grand gesture that helps resolve this and reassure India's security concerns.
All right, let's go and take a look at some of our friends online and what they have been seeing and commenting on the latest situation. On Twitter, we have a friend by the name of Sandan Doom saying that part of a larger problem is Indian decision makers and much of the media and public hold an exaggerated view of India's current economic heft. Yes, hundreds of millions of Indians downloaded TikTok, but as a profit center, India still remains tiny for many, if not all, foreign firms. Professor Huang, your thoughts?
I think that this kind of bans of 59 apps in India, to be frankly, doesn't make any sense from an economic perspective because, of course, it does not serve China's interest, but I don't think it serves India's interest either. This is not a situation that India is going to become a data colony of other powers. It's part of effort by both Indians and Chinese trying to optimize the production activities so that both sides can really take advantage of their, of this relationship so that both countries can gain economically. In today's world, it is unimaginable that any country, India included, of course, to isolate itself from the global market economy. I don't think that's wise. I think this kind of ban 59 apps is more a political move rather than an economic move. Again, like I said, it's to send a signal that India is going to stand tough against China politically. And second, this is more to appease the internal Indian national resentment rather than a kind of wise and rational economic decision. Because, no matter what, we can say that India simply cannot, and I don't think India will not, to be totally independent in terms of IT industry. Neither can China, because we have to be interdependent, get integrated into each other so that both of us can benefit from it. In the long run, I believe that just like Professor Mahoney just said, the Indian has to understand its best interest still relies on its traditional long alignment policy, and politically it's long alignment, but economically means the Indian position itself in the best way to work with other countries, including China and including the United States. Mm-hmm. This kind of unilateral ban of 59 apps of Chinese companies, I don't believe it can last very long.
Well, Professor Huang, you talked about non-alliance foreign policy of India. Mr. Deepak in New Delhi, do you think India, the current administration, still have a non-alliance foreign policy? How will the dynamics of domestic Indian politics impact the course of India's foreign policy regarding its non-alliance movement?
I think non-alignment is that long back. So if we see the fall of the Soviet Union or disintegration of the Soviet Union, it played a very significant role during the Cold War period. But even I think even during that time, I don't think India was totally non-aligned, and no country can be non-aligned in actual sense. But I think to respond to Professor Huang's assertion, I would like to make a small comment. I think the narrative of India-China relations, beyond the binary of friendship and animosities, it was built on two premises, and one was that China will not pose a security threat to India, and second, it will not harm India's interest in the neighborhood. And of course, I believe that it is because of the regional balance of power, or we'd say the global balance of power, it has been in the favor of China. So that's why China is behaving the way any big country they behave after acquiring military and economic muscle. But having said that, if this security dilemma it persists, and if these concerns they are not ameliorated, so then I think the kind of partnership India and China have witnessed in the last many years, I would say, especially China's investment in Digital India. In fact, most of Digital India startups in India, so they have been supported by Chinese venture capitalists or the Chinese capital. And also the other supply chains related to home appliances, related to solar cells, mobile telephony, electronics, automobiles, parts, so on and so forth. I think this was built on the premise that relationship between India and China, so it would be managed and handled sensitively. We will be, we will be sensible towards each other's sensitivities.
Professor Deepak, one company that was sanctioned by India is TikTok. I want to play you this comment from our friend online on Twitter. One Twitter user recently commented about the sanction of TikTok in India, saying that one question bothers me. Agreed, for whatever reason, we could not be at par with manufacturing capabilities of China, but why does China have so many popular apps? How come India's IT sector lost this race to China too? Why India could not come up with TikTok-like app before China? Professor Deepak, do you want to comment on that briefly?
Yeah, I think the focus, or I would say the economic models of both India and China, they determine the kind of heft you have in a particular area. So I believe the Chinese maybe information technology industry, so it is working in tandem with what China's plan, or I would say this Make in China 2025 goals are slated to be. So I think it is in sync with that. In India, we generally do not have that kind of a policy. So where we are contemplating in terms of fourth industrial revolution, as China has made huge headways and breakthrough. So the launching of all these apps and also its own platforms such as this Baidu and the WeChat and various others, basically competing with the global or the Google or other platforms along in the world. So this kind of strategy, I think, is not there. But of late, I think, as far as 5G is concerned, so Indian government, especially the Department of Technology, so they are venturing into this area and trying to build their own capacity. But I think it will take India a much longer time. As in China also, I think building capacity, it was built in the last 40 years, not in a day or night. So I think for India, if you want to build its own capacities, it will take long time.
Yeah, talk about it's 5G.
India doesn't have
Professor Deepak, Joseph in Tennessee, talking about 5G, India is considering not using Huawei's 5G technology in the country. To what extent do you think that has to do with Washington's active ongoing lobbying its allies and partners not to use Chinese and Huawei 5G networks?
I would say this has to...
Sorry, Joseph in Tennessee, can I go to you? Professor Deepak, hold on just 1 second.
Okay.
Joseph?
Thank you. I think the key issue here is that the United States has built up this narrative against Huawei that, and I've looked at, I've studied the Huawei issue in depth, and the story that you see from Washington on this consistently is not that there's evidence that Huawei has done anything to spy on foreign countries, or that it has actually been used by the Chinese government, merely that because Huawei is a Chinese company and it's in a country controlled by the Chinese government, that it is therefore a tool and asset of the Chinese government for spying on foreign countries. Now, I think there is no evidence of that. It's just the assumption that that could happen, and therefore, people have to guard against it. But the dark side of this, of course, is that it's been well established that the United States, especially after 9/11, with the Patriot Act and the various legislations and mechanisms that came out of that and that persist today, has used American technology, American firms, in order to collect big data, not only on foreign people, foreign governments, foreign countries, but also on their own people. And, I think there's this basic assumption that, China will do as we have done and worse, and will compete with us on those terms. So I think this is the fear that the U.S. has, and it does whatever it can to stoke this fear everywhere.
Well, Professor Huang, I'm sorry, but we have about 1 minute, a little over 1 minute left. Your thoughts on India's potential ban on Huawei over 5G networks?
I think that India, of course, India has to consider its own national interest on Huawei's 5G. And from what I can say, I don't see any, really important economic reasons or security reasons for India to ban Huawei's 5G. I think Indian government will take serious consideration to see what is there for India if India want to work with Huawei. On the other hand, I do believe India has its own independent thinking on U.S. narrative of Huawei. I think Indian people are very smart. They are very rational. So I have to wait and see. But I would be very surprised if Indian government decided to ban the Huawei's 5G just for pure this kind of a border clash or pure to appease national resentment at home. I don't think the Indian government would do that.
All right, Huang Jin, from Beijing Language and Culture University, B.R. Deepak, the chairperson at Jawaharlal University, and Joseph Mahoney from East China Normal University. Thank you all so very much. And that will do it for this edition of Dialogue. I'm Wang Wei in Beijing. Thank you so much for watching.